Hello, friends. Greg Kokel, your host here on Stand to Reason, and thank you for, of course, being part of our show. I say that every show, but I genuinely mean it. I'm glad that you're listening. I get reports from people all over the country where I get to travel and give talks, and they come up to me, and I'm just amazed. Just last weekend, someone said, I've been listening for 15 years, and well, that's great. You've been listening longer than my daughters have been listening to me. I tell you that. That's good. I'm flattered, and I trust it's because that we're giving you something valuable at STR. And I want to go right to a series of questions right now. These are questions that we call them open mic questions. And if you are not able to call in, if you'd like to leave a question for me, but you're not really able to call in very easily, waiting in line and all that entails, we get that. The live show is between 4 and 6 p.m. on Tuesday nights, Pacific time. So if you can call in that time and wait in the queue, that's great. All right. But some can't do that. And so we give an option of an open mic call. In other words, you go to our website at str.org. You look under podcast and live broadcast, and there it gives you an opportunity to submit an open mic question. And then you just follow the prompts, push the button, and then tell me your question. Try to keep it like a minute or a minute and a half at the most, and then I'll be able to respond. So you get to communicate live with me, if you will, kind of. But we don't maintain an exchange, obviously, but I can then respond to your question, and you can listen to it later when you listen to the show. Anyway, so that's open mic questions, and I'd like to start with Andrew. I didn't give Kyle an advance notice on this, but the question has to do. He's a youngster. How do we know God is real? But I'll let him raise the question himself. Andrew?
Hi, Mr. Kokel. My name is Andrew, and I have a question for you. I've gone to church my whole life, and I've recently gotten into Greek mythology and learned about evolution. My question is, how do we know God is real? And how do we know that the God of the Bible is the only true God? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. That was crystal clear. I wonder how old you are. Well, you sounded great. All right. Actually, you've asked a number of different or raised a number of different issues. And, what's interesting, Andrew, is that you remind me of my eldest daughter, because my eldest daughter was very verbally capable, like you are, very self-composed, able to express herself really well. And she read a lot, and she absolutely loved mythology, still does. And not just Greek mythology, but Roman mythology and Norse mythology. And so did not only C.S. Lewis, but so did J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings. So that you're in good company with that. The difficulty with Greek mythology, or the gods of Greek mythology, is they're all finite gods. They're all kind of like human beings, but only bigger. They have powers that humans don't have. They are superhero type beings, but they aren't the sole sustainer of the universe. And that's kind of what we're looking for as an explanation of everything. If those somewhat limited gods of all the mythologies are not capable of explaining their own existence, then what explains their existence? So all of those other gods are just not going to be adequate. The question that you asked then, you've been reading evolution or studying some things about evolution. I presume you mean Darwinian evolution. I don't have time to get into that topic because I think your question is a different question, but I realize that this is something that's on your mind. I do want to say this about it. Now, I don't believe that Darwinian evolution is an accurate explanation of how life developed on planet Earth. And I I reject that not because I'm a Christian, because there are Christians who accept that. I reject that because I don't think the science behind it is sound. Now, there's a lot that goes along with it, and I just mentioned I can't get into all that detail. But the point I want to make here is that even if Darwinian evolution is true, which I don't think it is, but even if it were, that wouldn't tell you anything about whether God existed or he didn't exist. It wouldn't tell you anything about whether Christianity is true or it wasn't true. It's, in a sense, it's a side issue. I'm not saying it's irrelevant. I think it is relevant. But strictly speaking, the truth of Christianity and the God of Christianity has no direct bearing on the question of Darwinian evolution. Darwinian evolution can be false and Christianity could be false. Darwinian evolution can be true and Christianity can be true. Okay. Darwinian evolution can be false and Christianity can be true, and Darwinian evolution, and et cetera, et cetera. I lost track of my options, but you get the point. So you're not going to settle the question about God and Christianity by looking at evolution, Darwinian evolution. So I want to remove that from the equation here. When my eldest daughter, who I was just referring to, was probably about 7 or 8 years old, she had already been baptized as a Christian. But she asked me the question you're asking me. She said, "Papa, how do we know that God is true?" is the way she put it. In other words, how do we know that our belief in God is accurate? All right. So I had to think about it for a moment, and because I wanted to try to explain it to her in a way that would make sense to her at 8 years old. And then this thought came to my mind, and I said it. And I realized that once I said it, this really is a good explanation or a good way of describing why I think the God of the Bible is true. Not just God in general, but also the God of the Bible. And the answer I gave her was, honey, the reason that we believe that God is true is because he's the best explanation for the way things are. The reason that we believe God is true is because he's the best explanation for the way things are. Now, I've said that many times on the program and speaking around the country because I think it's such a great way of summing up an approach to making the case for the truth of the Christian God. When we look at the world, there are a lot of things about the world that we know, we learn. We learn there's good and bad in the world. Okay, for example, there's good and there's bad. This is really obvious. You don't need any fancy thinking to realize that. There's good and bad in the world. We also realize that there's a reason why we're here. There is purpose, or we think it tragic when somebody commits suicide. Why do we do that? We think it's tragic because they wasted their life. But if life has no purpose, then there's no way to waste it. And there's a whole bunch of things that are kind of like this, Andrew, that we see about, the world's broken. There's good and there's bad, and the problem of evil and all of that. Even looking at something like Darwinian evolution, this is actually kind of a sophisticated enterprise if it works the way people think it works. That's probably not the kind of thing that's going to happen by accident, even though that's the claim about it. We see God's fingerprints in the way the natural world works. So as I look around the world and I notice things that are true, and I don't have to read my Bible to know these things. What I discover when I read my Bible is the biblical way of explaining the world and God seems to fit the way the world is when I'm just looking around discovering things about the world. I discover what appears to be really powerful evidence that God made the world in a very beautiful and complex way. I don't know if you know what Mount Rushmore is, but maybe you've even seen it. You might have seen pictures. If not, check it out with your folks. This is a side of a mountain in either North or South Dakota. I can't remember which one's which. I just know that the North is on the north side, the South is on the south side. But one of them have this place called Mount Rushmore, and a long time ago, long before you and I were born, some very clever people carved faces of 4 presidents into the side of that mountain. President Grant, President Washington, President Lincoln, and I think President Jefferson. Well, when you look at that, you don't say, wow, look at that mountain. Isn't it amazing how the wind and the rain and erosion made this look like faces of people that we know in our history? No, you'd never say that. You would know immediately and instantly that somebody carved those images because those images match the faces of presidents in our history. Well, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. We see all kinds of stuff like that as we look around the world. Now, I'm not going to get all technical on you on the scientific aspect of it, but there's lots and lots of books that are written about this. I'm just giving you the general answer. And it, as I mentioned, it can be summed up in the phrase that it's the best explanation for the way things are. You look at Mount Rushmore, what explains that? Well, sculptors explain that, with big giant chisels who can sculpt out those faces. That's what explains that. That's the best explanation. Rain and erosion isn't the best explanation. And this applies to so many other things. So by the way, there is more too. It's not just God, who's pretty clever making these things and we see his fingerprints, so to speak, but we also have Jesus, who shows up 2,000 years ago in Israel and then says he's the guy that made all that and everything. And then he does these amazing things. He's the God who came down. And then he does the kinds of things that God would do if he was a man. He lives a sinless life. He controls the forces of nature. He can heal people who are sick. He can cast demons out of people. He can raise the dead. How does he do that? Because he's God and man. So that's another avenue of evidence that I think is worth thinking about. Anyway, Andrew, I really appreciate your question, and I hope what I've offered is something that gets you thinking, all right, in a good way. And now I'm looking at my questions here, and I have one from Brock that was next after Andrew, and I can address that one. You want to grab that one? Brock.
Hey, Greg, this is Brock. Just wanted to start off by saying I really appreciate you and all the folks down there at Stand to Reason. I love your stuff, and I'm just super grateful for what you guys have been doing for the kingdom and for God's glory.
Well, thanks.
Now, with that being said, my question for today is, when do you think pursuing to know God intellectually becomes more of a hindrance than a help? Certainly, we are supposed to know God intellectually, and we're supposed to dig into his word and know his word well. But sometimes I feel like in my pursuit of knowing theology, I lose sight of the relationship I can be having with God, and my pursuit of theology is way more of a detriment to me in this season and in this time than it would be if I looked at God more as a relationship, looked at how I relate to him and love him and how I serve him more than just how I understand him. Any advice on this would be great, and I would appreciate any feedback that you give. All right. Thanks. Bye.
Well, thank you, Brock. This is a question that comes up somewhat frequently, and in a way, I understand it entirely. In another way, I don't relate so much to it. I certainly understand how people can learn facts about any particular thing and never have any personal investment in that thing. So you could, let's just take some kind of famous celebrity, and I can't even remember her name now. But just take any of them. You could become an expert in that celebrity, know all that information about that particular individual. You can when they were born, what they likes and dislikes, all these other things, but never know them. And so it's clear to me that there are two different categories of knowing. Okay, you can know that is specific information about somebody, but that's not the same as relational knowing, obviously. So there's that distinction. So I understand the concern. I guess in practical terms, I don't relate to it so much. I spend time studying all kinds of stuff, but I also have I spend time with God. I talk to Him. I lay my life out before Him. I thank Him for stuff. I guess if you are not pursuing the relational elements that are part of knowing God, and you're just knowing about God, well, then you're not obviously growing spiritually, it seems to me. Now, the relational elements are key. I'm sorry, I'm saying in the reverse order. Knowing about God is vital to having a proper relationship with God, because even our emotions and feelings and intimacy with God needs to be properly theologically informed. There are lots of people who have strong emotional attachments to who they think is God. LDS, your Mormon friends, many of them have a very strong affective, emotional relationship with Father God, but they are not worshiping the true God. That isn't the God of Jesus, the God of Paul, the disciples, the apostles, the God of Moses. It's a totally different characterization. They can have emotional responses there, but their facts are wrong about him. So this is what I'm saying. If I had to have one or the other, and in a certain sense, an intellectually, to use your language, sound, accurate understanding about God, and entering in as a Christian with a broad, sound foundation versus emotional. If it was one or the other, it's not. That's a false dichotomy. There's the intellectual, if you will, and the affective, the relational, the emotional thing that go hand in hand, just like any other relationship. But if I was one or the other, I would take the intellectual, because truth makes life safe. Feelings make life delicious, even my Christian life delicious. And I'm all for that. But I also know how easily it is for emotions to mislead people. Now, I'm campaigning here for a both and. But the affective, so-called relational side needs to be properly theologically informed. There is a foundation that needs to be in place so that you are relating to Christ properly. Jesus said in John chapter 4, God is spirit and must be worshiped in spirit and in truth. All right. So the truth is foundational, but it's not presented as a dichotomy in the text, but the two go hand in hand. Thy word is truth, Jesus said. But he's speaking here to the Father. I think that's in the John 17 when he's praying this intimate prayer to the Father. And so both go together. And if you find yourself learning lots about God but not being close to Him, this is where I think it would be good to give more attention. It's to two things. I mean, a lot of people say read the Bible and pray more or whatever, but I in the areas you're talking about, it just strikes me that there are two things that are really are going to make a big difference. The first one's worship. And when I say worship, I don't mean just going to church and singing along, because most of the worship that I hear does not move me. It annoys me, to be perfectly frank, because it's not well done. It's not good lyrics. It's not beautiful melodies. It doesn't move me. It doesn't draw me closer to God. And not that I'm trying to get an emotional high out of worship, but I think worship is meant to stimulate the affective aspect or element of human beings. That's why when you see in the Psalter and in heaven where the worship, there seems to be an effusive pleasure that's associated with it. And I find that when I feel really close to God, it's oftentimes when I'm being led in substantive worship as opposed to kind of religious noise. Sorry to put it that way, but this is the way it turns out a lot for me. And I'm in churches all around on Sunday, and sometimes the worship is really great. And when it's great, boy, I tell the people about it, I say, hey, thank you. That was super. I was uplifted. Okay. I felt closer to God as a result of that. Now, of course, the purpose of worship is not to feel something, it is to honor someone. But when it's done properly, I think our emotions follow. Okay, so that's one way of kind of feeling, in a certain sense, closer to God, not so intellectually sound, but emotionally removed. You'll feel closer with, I think, substantive worship. The second thing is prayer. And I know it sounds trite to say that. Oh, that's like, oh, yeah, oh, that. But my relationship, my friendship with God is more rich when my prayer life is more rich. It doesn't mean I'm praying a lot. It means I'm praying from my heart and talking to a person about things that matter to me. Not just intercession. I mean, I'm spending this time to honor God and to affirm our distinct roles. He is God and I am not. He is holy and I am not. I have a devotional that I use. It's called the Valley of Vision. And these are their prayers put together by Puritans a long time ago, gathered together in this booklet form. And I don't agree with everything that's there. Even this morning, I was crossing out words and writing my own words in. So the prayer reflected more genuinely my understanding of God and not this theological point that I disagreed with. You are everything and I am nothing. Well, I don't think I'm nothing. I don't think the Bible teaches that humans are nothing. I get kind of the point, but that's not the way I'd put it. Okay. You are holy and I am not. I'm not holy. Oh, there you go. But when I am before the Lord in an honest fashion and about my own liabilities and shortcomings and my desperate needs, oftentimes, I'm anguished. Then I feel a richer connection with God. And the prayer isn't just at those moments, like when you sit down and have your quiet time. I don't have a quiet time every morning. I can't when I schedule. But I do try to maintain a running conversation with God on a regular basis. As things come to mind, I will talk to Him about that, and I'll wonder about that, and I'll wonder out loud to Him about that. And if I'm bugged about something, I'll talk to Him about it. If I'm glad about something, I'll thank Him for it. And these are all ways that I nurture that element of my life. The intellectual aspect plays a part, and in part, it convinces me that I'm not talking to myself. But I also can have a deeper understanding of God as I study His Word and hopefully understand it accurately. There's one other factor that makes a huge difference, and I can say this is true in my own life, and I'm not alone in this, and that is people end up getting a lot closer to God when He allows them to go through trials and difficulties. That's just the fact of the matter. And as I look back on my own life, it's the bigger hardships that I've experienced that have forced me to my knees or forced me into the arms of God, screaming and kicking sometimes weeping, sometimes, just, where have I got to go? Who have I but you, kind of thing? Where can I go but to you? You are the one who have the words of eternal life, that kind of thing. So anyway, I've spent a bit of time on this one, Brock. But I think it's really important because a lot of folks who do the stuff that we do and kind of follow in these things end up facing this kind of challenge. And I think, as I mentioned, giving attention to worship that is substantive, focusing on talking to a person about the things that are genuine and meaningful in your life, in that kind of prayer, and then a daily ongoing conversation with God. That's the prayer side. And then making the best use of the hardship and difficulties in your life. Let them drive you to Him instead of away from Him. And that would be the best advice I could give you. So I thank you for your call, Brock. I hope that was helpful. I think it's time for a break. Let's do that. And we have some more questions we'll get to here on Stand to Reason. Greg Kokel back with you, giving you a piece of my mind today, and I'm thankful for the open mic calls here that we're using this hour to be able to give you a piece of my mind. That's what we've always been about here about the show. So I'm looking at Joy Miles, and she's raising a question about firstborn and begotten, or only begotten is the way the word goes. So Joy, what's on your mind?
This is Joy from Nebraska, and my question is about the wording about Jesus being the firstborn or begotten in many places in the New Testament. We are doing a study on presenting the gospel to Mormons, and that is a big question that's always kind of confused me in some of the Bible verses, because of course Mormons think he was literally the son of God. And I've listened to a podcast of Michael Heiser's, and I don't think I'm quite smart enough to understand everything he says. But anyway, I really appreciate it, and I just want to thank you for all your work and all you guys do there. You're quite a gift to the kingdom. Thank you.
Mm. Well, that's really sweet, Joy. I appreciate that. This is actually, I don't think you need to go to Mike Heiser for this one, because it's not that hard. The problem is when you're talking about firstborn or only begotten. It's not just begotten. In the English, it's only begotten. And in my translations, I'm just looking here. In the case of the firstborn, that's one word. All right, firstborn. It's not firstborn, but it's firstborn. All right. And when it comes to only begotten, I'm looking here in 1 John. I make that John 1:14. You see that phrase there. Now they separate the words, and it's unfortunate because the Greek words for both of those terms are individual words. They're not two words. So only begotten doesn't mean the only one that is begotten. As begotten sounds like a beginning. You beget a child. That you have no children, then you beget one, and he's the only one you begotten, so to speak. Okay, so in the English, it gives a misleading sense. In the Greek, it's only one word. The word is monogenes, monogenes. That's the anglicized for the Greek. Monogenes. In other words, one of a kind is what it means. the only one of its kind, the only monogenes kind or genre. Think of it that way, or genus, if you will. And you can find that word in John chapter 1 and verse 14. And the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory as of the monogenes from the Father, full of grace and truth. In other words, of the one and only, the one of a kind from the Father. And this is where the English translation is, I don't even like it. I don't know why they do that, only begotten, instead of saying the one and only or something like that. In any event, that's the word. It's not two words, it's one word, monogenes. All right. And what's interesting about the John chapter 1 passage is you mentioned LDS, your Mormon friends. Oh, this is huge with JWs too, Jehovah's Witnesses, because what they want to say is, see, here's the text says, John chapter 1, verse 14, he's the only begotten. God begot Jesus, which they take to mean created. God created the Word that became flesh in Jesus. All right. The problem there is that's verse 14 of John chapter 1. Here is what John says in verse 3 of that chapter. He says, all things came into being through him. Now, this is the same word that became flesh in verse 14. All things came into being through him. Wait a minute. All things came into being through him. He was the one who made all things. And apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. John says in two separate ways in the same sentence, the same thing, so it can't be misunderstood. The Word created everything that was ever created, which means the Word is uncreated. And if the Word is uncreated, that means the Word is what? Starts with a G, a capital G. The Word is God. So John isn't going to identify the maker of everything that's ever been made in verse 3 as the Word, and then say in verse 14, and that one was created, because that would be a contradiction. And that's not what the word means. Monogenes means only begotten, or one and only. It's a single word that's described in two words that creates confusion. Now, you have another word, though, firstborn. And here I see in Colossians chapter 1, verse 15, that word is used. This is Jesus being described by Paul in Colossians. He rescued us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. And by the way, that is a statement by Paul that I actually use as a prayer for people that I love that don't know Christ. And my prayer is his words. It's not a promise. It's a description of what happened to us, and I'm asking God to do it to others. Lord, rescue them from the domain of darkness and transfer them to the kingdom of your beloved Son, in whom there is redemption and forgiveness of sin. So that's my prayer. So that's an aside. No extra charge. Next verse, verse 15. For he, Jesus, the one who rescued us from the domain of darkness, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. And there in English, it's just one word, and it ought to be, because in the Greek you also have only one word. And that word is prototokos. Prototokos. Now, I understand that when you read firstborn, you're tempted to think, oh, that's a birth order. It's the first one that was born. And if he was born, that means he was created, and that means he was the first one created, which is what Jehovah's Witnesses believe. But it can't be that, based on what John has already said in John chapter 1 and verse 3, that all things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. And And actually, the very next verse, after it mentions in Colossians 1, verse 15, about the firstborn of all creation, the next verse says, "For by him all things were created, both in heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him." Verse 17, "He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." So verse 15 cannot be referring to one that is created, given the word firstborn in the English, because the next verse he says he made everything, just like John did in John chapter 1. And what's interesting is you have these verses, one by John in John chapter 1, only begotten, and one by Paul in Colossians chapter 1, firstborn. And both of them have companion verses in their context that say that Jesus created everything, or the one who became Jesus, the Word, created everything that was ever created. So those words can't mean created. Now, I explained only begotten means monogenes, one of a kind. That's the point. Nobody else is like Jesus. He's the only one of a kind. The Word became flesh. And the same thing is kind of true in the prototokos, or firstborn. Firstborn, two words, means the first one born. Firstborn, one word, doesn't mean the first one that was birthed. It means preeminent one. Preeminent one. Now, we know that partly because the following verse says that he created all things. And notice in verse 17, he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He's the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning. There it is, verse 18 again, the firstborn from the dead, so that he may come to have first place in everything. For it was the Father's good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him. So you have a description now of what we understand, at least what those people would have understood, as a person, an individual who have had a preeminent role. Characteristically, that was the first one in the birth order, the first male in the birth order. But that's not consistently the case, because we have a number of cases where, and I've just written this in my margin here in pencil, in Genesis 41:51, you have Manasseh born first, but Ephraim is called the firstborn. In other words, first in rank. We see Jeremiah 31:9. You see Psalm 89:27. Again, I can't cross-reference those for you right now. I'm just letting you know those are the verses that I've written down here. You can check them yourself, but these are Old Testament verses that help you to see that the firstborn is the preeminent one, not necessarily the one who is first in birth order, which is the very point that's being made by Paul in Colossians. So, Joy, neither of these words that we see in English, firstborn or only begotten, imply in the text, nor were they meant to be implied by those authors, that Jesus was created. But rather, in the two cases I identified in John chapter 1 and also Colossians chapter 1, both writers make it clear that Jesus was the uncreated creator, and that would be God. That would be God. Now, of course, Jesus is unique. He's the God-man. So he is fully human as well as fully divine, 100% God, 100% man, one person, two natures. That's called the Chalcedonian formula. It took them a couple hundred years to work that out in very precise terms, but that's orthodoxy. So I hope that helps, Joy, and maybe when you talk to your LDS friends or JW friends, you can just make the point that the words in Greek do not mean what the English translations seem to imply. And when we look closer at the passages in question, this becomes really clear. All right? So let's take another quick break, and then we've got a couple other questions I'd like to get to with open mic calls. All right, we have a little bit more than 10 minutes to go. I've got 3 different questions here. We might get to 2 of them probably, but we'll eventually get to all of them. So I want to hear from Beth on the question about Abraham in Genesis 22, because this is a passage that plagues a lot of Christians, and I have some thoughts on it that might be helpful. Beth?
Hi, Greg. My name is Beth. I am in Plano, Texas. Thank you so much for your Stand to Reason show. I enjoy listening to it. I've learned so much. The question I want to ask today is regarding Genesis chapter 22, the testing of Abraham by God with sacrificing his son Isaac. I have struggled with that story. I've been a believer for many, many years, and I've read Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster? And I know he goes into it in that book. And I probably need to go over that chapter again, but I could just use more clarification. I feel like that particular test seems so cruel and capricious and just hard to understand. And I know I need to place it in the culture, in the context, knowing the attributes of God. I would just like some explanation there and some clarification. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, you're so welcome, Beth. This is a tough one, at least at first blush. And I'm going to share some standard stuff with you that I've known for a while that's been helpful for me, but I'm also going to share some things that I actually got from David Wood. David Wood, many of you know, is an apologist who deals with Islam. And he's a unique guy. Let's just put it that way. And I happened to see this broadcast, his podcast. It was actually right after his own son had passed away. He had a special needs boy. He had a couple of them, and one passed away. And it was in the context of that he's responding to this Genesis 22 challenge from atheists who are raising that particular issue against him. And regarding your concern that the demand that God made of Abraham was cruel and capricious, I don't think it was cruel because it wasn't carried out. It wasn't capricious because it wasn't based on caprice, which is like a whim of the moment. There was a very important, significant reason for why God did this. One of them was a test of Abraham's faith, trust in God. So this will become more clear when I share a detail that I hadn't thought about, but I got from David Wood. And it makes perfect sense. There was a lot of child sacrifice going on at that time. It was one of the things that God condemned in the people that lived in those lands. One of the things that brought God's wrath on those peoples. The idolatry that included, in many times, like on a massive scale, child sacrifice. And later on, after Abraham, when the law is given, the Jews were forbidden to do that. And they were forbidden to do that because it was wrong. Now, of course, Abraham, this is 50 years before that, I guess. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Yeah, that's right. So you get 400 years of captivity, and 500 years before that. So you have a different. He doesn't have all that information. What he does know is this all is happening around him, and it's happening for a reason. And this is what I got from David Wood. The reason is because sacrificing the thing that is most close to you is the most powerful way to express your faithfulness and love for the God to whom you are sacrificing. Okay, so what we're doing right now is we are looking at the cultural context of this. Again, I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying this is the way the culture viewed it. So when God told Abraham to sacrifice his son, it was no different than what was happening with the other cultures where their gods seemed to be asking for a sacrifice that was an evidence of the great love of those who worshiped them. But Abraham had a unique situation because this same God who is asking for a sacrifice was also the God who promised him a son from whom would come a great nation, which would ultimately be a blessing to all the other nations. That son was Isaac. Abraham knew this. And therefore, one of two things was going to be the case. Him knowing the promise that God made and then having this command given by God to sacrifice a son, one of two things are going to happen because of the prior promise. Either the sacrifice would not go through, or if it did, God would raise Isaac from the dead. Now we know the second because, and pardon me because I can't recall the text here. I might get a note here from Amy. I'll keep my eye on that. Because in the New Testament, it does say that. Abraham knew that God was able to fulfill this promise regarding Isaac, even if it meant he had to raise Isaac from the dead after the sacrifice. Make sense? That's what the text says. Oh, okay. So that's one possible. We also know that when he's going up the mountain, he's got a servant. And he tells the servant, you stay here. I'm going to go up with Isaac, and we will return. And when Isaac asks, Dad, where's the sacrifice? He says, God will provide the sacrifice. So we get hints in the text of Abraham itself that he knows more is going on. And then we have detail in the New Testament that he was expecting God, if he's going to go through with it, which he didn't think so, we will return. But if he returned, that would be by a resurrection because God made the prior promise. So do you see all of this that's going on? And the cultural circumstance that this is a way of showing your great love for God. Then what happens? At the last moment, God stays his hand. Why does he stay his hand? Because he does not want child sacrifice. He is showing Abraham he is not like the other gods. He did discover the great commitment that Abraham had for God because he was willing to sacrifice his only son. And there you have a type of Christ, so obvious, no duh. But he didn't have Abraham go through with it, nor did he ever intend that. He was testing Abraham's love just the way the culture would understand that love to be tested with a child sacrifice. But he said, no, don't do this. And then, of course, later in the law, we understand God doesn't want child sacrifice. But here was a statement of that same nature in the issue with Abraham. So it was neither cruel nor capricious. Though I'm sympathetic, I understand why you'd see that. And when you see these other details, you realize there's a whole lot more going on. And ironically, given the complaints, this was an example of God making it clear child sacrifice is not what he wants. Okay? So I hope that helps, Beth. Appreciate the call. How about Kate? We got 3 minutes here. Let's talk with Kate. Hear her, because I think I can respond to this quickly. Kate, right below Beth.
Hi, Greg. My name is Kate. Before I get to my question, I wanted to just say thank you for your ministry. It's really impacted my life the last few years, especially when I had my second daughter. I think you'll find this funny. When I was in labor with her, I had a birth playlist with music and stuff that would, I thought I would like to listen to help me get through. But instead, in the moment, I ended up listening to your podcast, and it really helped me to just stay calm and grounded, and gave my mind something else to think about. And you can hear her in the background right now. She's 6 months. So to my question, I've gotten into a few discussions with atheists recently over the idea of God-given rights. And basically they'll just say, that's ridiculous. God doesn't exist. Therefore, we can't have God-given rights. And so I just wondered how you might respond to that. Thanks. I appreciate everything you do.
Thank you, Kate. And that's a first for me. I made it to the birthing room, and that was a big help, apparently. So, all right. So the atheist says we can't talk about God-given rights because there is no God. He's right. If there is no God, there are no God-given rights. Now, they think there is no God. So therefore, there are no God-given rights. If there is no God, there are no God, and there isn't a God, therefore there are no God. That's a modus tollens. That's an entirely legitimate argument, the way it's the formal argument. They're right. But what they don't realize is that, or at least not willing to admit, is there are transcendent rights. Now, if there are no God-given rights, that means they're not transcendent. The only rights that we have are the rights that we give people in power give to people who don't have power. Rights are just delivered. You have a claim to this if we say so. If we give you the right, then we can take the right away. And that's all you've got. And what this means then is there's not going to be any way you can appeal to a government that is acting in what seems like an untoward, inappropriate way by saying you're doing wrong because we have a right not to be treated that way. Either rights come from governments, people in power, or they come from God, above the people in power. If they come from God, then when people in power are abusing the God-given rights, then we can appeal to God, or we can appeal to him, at least in argument, say, you aren't doing what's right. That's what they did at Nuremberg. But if there is no God, then you can't appeal against any power who gives rights or takes them away. There is no appeal because there's no basis on which you can give that appeal. So the way I'd put it is, if there is no God, there are no God-given rights, i.e. transcendent rights above all others. But there are transcendent rights, and only God can give those, so therefore there is a God. The debate can go either way. The argument can go either way. It all depends on whether or not we have transcendent rights. If we can make the case against abusive governments that they ought not live that way because there is a law above the law, then that law above the law has to be accounted for. If there is no way to account for it, it's not there. You can't make that appeal to governments. Anyway, that's the argument. Did it. Thank you so much for listening, friends. Greg Kokel here at Stand to Reason. Give them heaven. Bye-bye.